Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of how to talk policy and influence people. And today I am very excited and very honored to be joined by one of my massive heroes in the trauma and neuroscience world, Dr. Bruce Perry. Hi, Dr. Perry, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you for having me on this show. I have to say, I'm interested in even the title of this series, because it's something that we've struggled with for decades, really.
Yeah, how to actually influence policymakers, you mean?
Exactly.
Get what
And how
needs
to
to be
communicate.
done.
I think it's one of the biggest challenges in our field is that there are these bodies of knowledge and people that have expertise, and it's amazing to me how infrequently that is translated into practice and policy. And in the beginning, when I was starting out, as a young academic and clinician, I didn't know anything about really how policy was created. And I just assumed that when people were told stuff, they'd go, "Oh, great idea.
Yeah,
let's,
yeah.
let's
Thanks for
change.
telling me.
Yeah. Oh, now that we know that, let's change the law." You're like, "Yeah, that'd be smart."
Yeah.
But
If
it took
only,
a while.
Dr. Perry, if only.
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
before we talk a bit more about policy and child trauma and many other issues to do with the brain, can you just tell me a little bit about yourself and your background and your professional expertise?
Sure. I was originally trained as a neuroscientist, studied the development of the stress response systems in animals, and particularly focused on how early developmental experiences influenced how those systems organized and how they worked. And then I became a clinician and studied, again, the brain in humans, and ultimately became a child psychiatrist, and then kind of merged those two bodies of experience, brain development and clinical work, into the current direction that we have, that our working group has had for really about 30 years now. And that's to study from a lot of different perspectives, to study how experience influences the development of the brain, both in good ways and bad. And then what are the implications of that? What are the implications for education and mental health and juvenile justice? And we're even looking at it, how it manifests in sport and in the corporate environment and a lot of other settings. So.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Perry. So one of the phrases that really struck me early on in my reading, because obviously I have a legal background, not anything to do with child trauma or neuroscience, but I was researching prisoners. And so I got interested in traumatic histories and attachment experiences. But neuroscientists say the brain is a social organ. What does that actually mean?
Well, if you look back sort of as human beings, sort of from the perspective of a biologist, you look at different species, and the human species is basically a very social species. And the way that we create cohesion within members of our species is using all of the mental apparatus, the brain related capabilities. So we have these neurobiological capabilities to kind of study somebody's face and interpret, sometimes inaccurately, but we get an interpretation of what they're intending to communicate and convey. And big parts of the evolution of our cortex are probably related to trying to manage the complexities of social interactions in groups. And if you look at, over history, the humankind is, individuals develop interdependently. We depend upon other people to survive and succeed. Even though in certain cultures we focus on individuality and independence, the reality is human beings are interdependent. And so that's kind of what most people that are talking about the brain as a social organ, that's what they're talking about. That you really can't, you can't really get within 2 or 3 synapses of any part of the brain and not connect it to some form of connecting to connecting with and communicating to other people. So we're very socially biased.
Yeah, I like that Ubuntu phrase, I am because you are, for that very, it kind of captures that very nicely, that my existence is kind of contingent on the other people around me, and helps shape my self-perceptions, maybe even.
Yeah.
One of the things I've been reading about quite recently is this concept of the evolved nest by Darcia Narvaez. And you and your writing colleague, Maya Salovitz, I hope I've pronounced her name correctly there, in your great book, Born for Love, mentioned Sarah Hrdy's findings about the importance of alloparents in hunter-gatherer societies. So Dr. Perry, my question then is, in terms of modern child rearing practices in the Western world especially, are they conducive to optimal child development?
Well, one of the things about our brain that's served us well as a species is that it's very malleable and adaptable. And that's allowed us as a species to basically invent things and pass them to the next generation very efficiently. And so we have this social cultural evolution. And being a lawyer, being familiar with the law, that law is basically a reflection of that social cultural evolution. If you look at the evolution of law, it's fascinating. It used to be very primitive, very simple. There weren't very many laws. But as human beings lived in increasingly complex environments, we needed more regulatory stuff. And then the laws became voluminous. And it's the same. So that's a roundabout way of saying basically that because of this changeability, we've changed the way we raise children over the generations. And there are lots of cultural variations of how we take care of our kids and help them grow up. But one of the fundamental things that's happened in the last maybe 200 years is that as we've become more urbanized in particular, and we've moved towards the accumulation of material wealth and privacy, our living groups have become smaller and smaller and smaller. And really what that means is that whoever has the child, the newborn baby, instead of having dozens of people around you in physical proximity to help distribute the caregiving burden, that the caregiving burden and the parenting burden, which are different, they're overlapping, but they're different responsibilities. They all end up falling squarely on the back of a single person frequently in the Western world. And if you have multiple children and you have one person who has to meet the physical, social, emotional, motor needs of multiple children at once, that's a big ask. It's biologically disrespectful and fundamentally at odds with the way our species evolved. So in reality, a newborn child and a young mother in a hunter-gatherer environment would have lots of other people around who would get food, supervise the older kids, rock the baby once in a while, give you a break. And so the caregiving burdens are distributed amongst multiple people so that no one person is completely overwhelmed. And that ultimately that improves the probability that the young vulnerable child will survive and thrive, and that clan will be healthier, and that the species will go on. But in the West, that's very, very, it doesn't happen very often anymore. We think that the nuclear family is a great idea when even two parents and multiple kids that's not ideal either.
Yeah, it's stressful.
Very
and then
stressful.
If it's a less than optimal, I guess, family unit, then the child isn't getting the benefit of a wider community experience, or just if the parents are highly stressed for a variety of reasons, they're not getting maybe the break either that they need to replenish themselves and their resources.
Exactly. And I think, Jane, that point is, from my perspective, for the youngest kids, that's the most important point.
Okay.
It's that the adults who have the primary responsibility for the baby, they get a break.
Hmm.
They get their needs met. We always talk about the ratio, what's the ratio of caregiver to child?
Yeah.
I think a more important ratio in the first year of life is what's the ratio of caregiving contacts to caregiver
Yeah.
rather than caregivers to child.
Yeah. Are we minding the moms or whoever is caring for our infants?
Exactly. And we're not very good at that. I've written a little bit about this and talked about this a lot, but we think it's a great caregiving ratio to have one caregiver and 4 or 5 little children. But in a hunter-gatherer clan, if you look at that at population equilibrium, there were at least 4 developmentally mature individuals in that social environment for every child under the age of 6. And so the caregiving responsibilities were distributed in ways that really didn't overwhelm any one person. The other part of that that's very important is that if you had a parent who, for whatever reason, was overwhelmed, exhausted, and started to be neglectful to the infant, they didn't just sit around and watch it.
Yeah. Yeah.
They actually, and they also didn't extrude the mother from the clan.
Yeah.
They took the baby and took care of the baby while they also addressed the needs of this depressed, overwhelmed parent.
Mm-hmm.
So,
so they held her,
Yeah.
and held the baby at the same time. So I think this connection or this question connects nicely then to that. You use the phrase, and some of your colleagues also have used this phrase, relational health, and that it's really important to babies and children, but it's also important to adults. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely. There have been people who have been studying this for a long time, but it's become more sort of, people have become more aware of it more recently. But the best predictor of your physical health and your mental health is not your genetics, not your access to tertiary care services. It's these simple community health factors, like how many grocery stores are within walking distance of your house? What's the turnover of your neighbors in your neighborhood?
Okay. Yeah.
Things like that really are focusing on just what you said, Jane. This connectedness to the people around you is a really, really important variable in physical and mental health. And we have some ideas about why that is, but it's an observation that's been made from multiple different directions. Lots of different researchers have seen it. And I think, again, it's like a lot of areas in the neurosciences that we're just beginning to kind of scratch the surface of what the mechanism is.
Mm-hmm.
But we definitely know that it's a very powerful and very true phenomenon.
Okay. And can you maybe explain to me and the viewers what the link then between safety, attachment, or you also use the phrase nurturant care, how important that is, especially in the first 3 months to a year of life, and then child trauma? How are these things, how do they overlap very often?
Yes. Well, let me back up for 1 second and just
Sure.
do a little explaining about these stress response systems that we have in our brain. And everybody has them. We all have these incredible complex apparatus that are in all parts of our body that help us cope with any stressor, hunger, thirst, cold, saber-toothed tigers, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. We have a whole variety of systems that will respond differentially depending upon whatever the threat is. And one of the really important parts of those, of that collective system, is in the lower part of the brain. And it's kind of where all of our sensory input from the outside world comes in, and all of our sensory input from the body, feedback from, like, are you hungry, thirsty, cold? It all goes into these lower parts of the brain. And then depending upon the incoming signals, what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you internally are experiencing, these systems will turn on parts of the brain, turn off other parts that you don't need right now. And it really is like, it's like Grand Central Station. It just sort of manages everything. Now, these systems are exquisitely sensitive to the presence of people. This is kind of where the social brain part comes in. That so when your brain sees that you are in the presence of people who you belong to, you're part of this clan, this group, this family, those systems basically feel safe. And when that happens, they allow the top part of the brain, the thinking part of your brain, to be open.
Mm-hmm.
So when you feel safe, you can reflect on the past, and you can think about the future. You can think about the consequences of your behavior. You can put together, things that you didn't put together in the past, and be creative and all kinds of great stuff. But when you're in the presence of people, when there's nobody around and there is some potential threat, your brain basically starts to shut down the top part of your brain, the thinking part of your brain, and sort of becomes dominated by the acting part of your brain. And what happens is all of the smart things that you knew and that you've learned are not as easily accessible to you. So you are more likely to be impulsive. You're more likely to be reactive in the face of some sort of threat or challenge. And if you are in that state and somebody's trying to communicate with you, a couple things will happen. Number one is that you'll distort what they're communicating. There'll be sort of a short circuiting of what they're really trying to say. And then the second thing is that whatever they're communicating, because of it, this short circuiting process never accurately gets to your cortex. So if the teacher's trying to communicate math, the child who's in that state will not learn math.
Mm-hmm.
And so day after day after day, if they're in that state a lot, they'll fall behind academically. And that, of course, leads to a whole cascade of other problems for kids who do poorly in school. Nobody likes to go someplace where they're continually getting negative feedback,
Sure.
where they're continually failing.
Yeah.
So the minute they can drop out, they drop out. And then that leads to a whole set of transgenerational problems because they're not very employable. And if you're not employable, you can't make a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't make a lot of money, it's hard to live in the modern world. And, people end up having these sort of maladaptive cycles of poverty and failure and stress and distress that lead to increased probability that you'll have physical health problems, increased probability that you'll have mental health struggles, increased probability that you'll turn to drugs and alcohol to regulate your distress about what is going on in your life, which leads to an increased probability that you're going to have to do antisocial and or criminal things to get money, to get your self-soothing medication, to deal, it's just this interconnected mess that all has to do with the regulation of the stress response system.
Okay.
Not that this stress response system, the set point of how reactive and how flexible it is largely determined by your experiences early in life.
Yeah, that is amazing. And do you, just in terms of the criminal justice system now, I mean, we might be a little bit more sympathetic or empathetic to teenagers. But certainly some of the men I'd have interviewed who were, 20 years in prison on and off, there'd be very little sympathy in a judge's head or heart left for men like that. But so what you're saying is a lot of it goes back to those very earliest years and
absolutely
the quality of the
care. This has been your experience. If you talk with these folks and they tell you their story, you realize that sometimes even before they were born, you can map out the trajectory where they're going. But certainly as you start to hear what their parents had to deal with, their mother was raised in the system.
Mm-hmm.
Their father, they never knew. Their mother had no money. She was abused. She used.
Mm-hmm.
He went to live with grandma. Grandma died when he was 3. I mean, just you could literally cascade this stuff. And the thing for me, honestly, is I'm always astounded that these individuals haven't done things that are more heinous
Yeah.
than what's gotten them into jail.
Mm.
Because they're, I don't think I've ever met anybody in prison who hasn't had a really rough start.
Yeah.
In one way or another. Now sometimes it's a rough start in the way that they may have had money
Mm-hmm.
or resources, but they had a mentally ill, sort of incredibly emotionally abusive caregiver.
Yeah.
Actually Dorothy Otnell Lewis, I think she's just written a new book or written some papers about a lot of the people that she interviewed who were famous criminals,
Okay.
serial killers, for example, like Ted Bundy, excuse me. And she finally went back and recognized that, oh, wow, he really was neglected as a child. He did have an abusive early childhood.
Mm.
And I think it's very obvious in many cases, and in other cases you have to dig a little bit deeper, but you just don't do inhumane things unless you've been treated inhumanely. I mean, that's just it.
And in Born for Love as well, the subtitle is Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered. Can you just say a little bit about how empathy is actually laid down or more or less established in that attachment relationship or in the presence or absence of nurturant care?
Sure. So this is my quick thumbnail reconstruction of infinitely complex stuff. So the bottom line is that the brain is very complex and it organizes very rapidly early in life. And this core regulatory network, these stress response related systems are also involved in reward and pleasure. So a lot of people have probably heard of the reward centers and the pleasure neuroscience. These neural networks are involved in that. And they're also involved in what you could broadly refer to kind of as the neurosociology systems, the systems involved in forming and maintaining relationships. And the way these systems get woven together is really based on a very simple principle in neuroscience. And that is that in order for your brain to begin to make sense out of the world, it has to connect things. It connects patterns of neural activity that co-occur. So sound comes into your brain separately than vision. And so when your little brain is trying to make sense out of the world and you see a dog and you hear a bark, those are two different patterns of neural activity. But if you hear them again and again and see them simultaneously again and again and again, your brain ultimately weaves together, literally makes physical synaptic connections in parts of your brain between the sight and the sound. And that's how we make sense out of the world, right? We make sense, a certain touch becomes associated with a certain, facial expression, a certain tone of voice. And that becomes connected with the feeling of love and having your needs met and feeling the pleasure of having your hunger quenched. And so the newborn, without these systems yet connected, when they get hungry or thirsty or cold and their parent comes, and could be other people, but let's assume that it's the parent predominantly. The parent comes and the little baby's brain begins to connect the image of the parent, the smell of the parent, the sound of the parent with the pleasure that comes from having your hunger, satiated and having your thirst quenched. And so the stress response systems, the relational systems and the reward systems all become woven together. And that becomes the neurobiological framework for what we call attachment.
Mm-hmm.
And attachment is basically a set of memories. You know, it's a complex set of memories that we create early in life based upon our first caregiving experiences. And if the caregiver is present and attentive and attuned, our brain starts to associate human relational cues, people, with safety and with pleasure and with good things. Mm. And if your caregiver is depressed, absent, episodically angry, overwhelmed, your brain connects people with unpredictability, inconsistency. Sometimes you love me, sometimes you're gone, sometimes you hurt me, sometimes you yell at me, sometimes you love me. I don't know what to make out of you. Yeah. And so in the brain of the infant, and then the child is like, people are something that you keep at arm's length and you just never know what to make of them. Can't really trust them. You long to be connected to them because of this deep neurobiological pull to belong. But when you get too close, you get anxious.
Right.
And you need to control that relationship. And if there's unpredictability to it, you flee. Anyway, I could go on and on, but that's where that...
I find it fascinating. As a mom myself, I remember though reading it and going, wow, you know, people don't know this. Many new parents have no idea. They do their best, but also some of the kickback to attachment theory and even neuroscience from, say, the social science world is about early years determinism, mother blaming, and that type of thing.
Yeah.
And that
it's interesting. There's so much more of that in England than there is anywhere else in the world that I've been.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And I think it's because it almost, my understanding of those arguments is that those people don't seem to read very much neuroscience.
Right.
I mean, the neuroscience doesn't say any of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The neuroscience is actually quite evolved about appreciating that connectedness is a powerful element of shaping how the brain works and functions, and that the brain continues to be malleable to social interactions. But somehow that, you know, there are people get stuck in their worldview and
yes,
you know,
and then
kind of
resistant to hearing any other message. The same arguments are also maybe made by similar groups of critical academics about the ACEs science, so the Adverse Childhood Experiences studies. In your expertise, is the ACEs science valuable, or aspects of it valuable? And then what are its limitations?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I just wrote a book and we talk about that a lot in the book. One of the things that's so fascinating to me is how, again, this illustrates to me one of the issues related to the first question, why policy and practice don't change when they're faced with new information. But it has to do with that human beings really like simple explanations. And so one of the things that happened with the ACE study, it's an epidemiological study. The ACE survey is a completely useless clinical tool.
Okay.
You know, I mean, it's ridiculous to use it as a clinical tool. It's an epidemiological survey. But as an epidemiological measure, then looking at the correlates of outcomes, they were wonderful studies. Now, the thing about science is that once you get sort of this nice epidemiological introduction to an area, you don't just keep repeating that same study again and again and again and again and again, but that's kind of what has happened. You really want to go, all right, well, now that we see this broad correlation, let's look a little bit more closely. Let's look at the timing of when something happened.
Yeah.
Let's look at whether or not it makes a difference that there were connections, you know, were there buffers to the adversities? Did the pattern of adversity matter? Did the type of adversity matter? Did the genetic makeup of the person give them some hardiness to resist adversities? all of these are really important questions. And unfortunately, one of the things that's happened with the ACE movement,
Mm-hmm.
which is different than actually the ACE study, is
Sure.
that people wanting these simple explanations latched onto that epidemiological study and have been pushing it into program and policy in ways that make scientists like me, or who want a much more nuanced, complex examination of these issues, kind of go, oh, wait, you know,
Yeah.
stop, you know. Now, part of what's happened is, and this is kind of classic, is that there are some people who want to basically throw the baby out with the bathwater and go, oh, the ACEs is all BS.
Mm.
But the ACE epidemiological study isn't BS. It's really good work. It's really good. It's important. Probably the most important thing about it is that it is, and this is maybe a bad thing to say, but policymakers didn't care
Right.
if a sociologist came up and said, hey, you know, we know that kids that are abused fail in school and end up in prison. They're like, oh yeah, that's too bad.
Yeah. They needed hard science to draw the links.
Well, here's what I would argue.
Yeah.
The science that the sociologist presented was just as hard as the epidemiology science,
Right.
if not harder, if not
Right.
better.
Okay.
It is science.
Yeah.
It is science. It's just different science.
Yeah.
The ACE studies is actually as loose as science as you can get. I mean, it's an epidemiological study. I mean, they said, you know, they asked 10 questions of people that are over 30 years old.
But
that's like as loose as you can get. And so the ACE study is it's like a 50,000 foot flyover. You're basically
right.
going, oh, I can see that there's mountains down there and there's an ocean. That's about all you can say. Now, once you see that, oh, there's an ocean and there's a mountain, let's go look at the mountain and the ocean. So you got to fly lower. You got to ask more questions. You have to ask them in depth. And ultimately, if you're doing clinical work, you have to get on the ground, and then you have to sit with a person and go, tell me your story.
For
and
sure.
then I can help understand what's going on with you. And that's the problem, is that that people have had this weird idea that they can fly 50,000 feet over a person's life and go, hey, you know, fill this form out and I'll tell you why you have cancer. And the fact that maybe you smoked for 40 years might have had something to do with it too.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I'm
Sure.
just saying.
Yeah. But on the other hand, for example, because I'd be quite familiar with some of the ACE Aware Nation people in Scotland, and I've been at lots of events, and many people who have survived like very difficult childhoods and multiple adversities find the information kind of a revelation to them, because it explains, like, if they've had serious addictions and mental health problems, relational problems, been in and out of prison, all of a sudden they're not broken beyond repair necessarily, especially when they're given a hopeful message about the importance of relationships. So is there a value in that?
Let me just sort of, so Jane, there's nothing in the ACE studies about relationships at all.
Right.
So part of what's happened is that, in part in response to the pushback from people like me, for example, the people that sort of love ACEs have started to go, oh yeah, and relationships are important, and which is great. But I have nothing at all against the use of the ACE study to help shift people's perspective about the importance of their own personal developmental history in influencing how they function. We've been trying to talk about that for years. And I think that's the real power of the ACE study, is that it is helping people shift their frame of reference to recognize that what happened to somebody is actually very important in the way they function. But it's not deterministic.
Yes.
And this is part of my objection to the and I would call it a misuse of the ACE studies, is to even call, people say, well, what don't you believe in the ACE science? And I'm like, well, what is ACE science? What are you talking
Right.
about? What does that mean? The movements are based on emotion and enthusiasm.
So true. Yeah.
And that's kind of what is going on. There's enthusiasm about how powerful and important it is. And a lot of times that makes people sort of get overly defensive about anybody who chooses to go, hey, that's not the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the people who did the ACE study, Rob Anda, as you probably know, published it, a very...
He said, yeah, not for use in that way. That's not what was meant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I've said the same thing too, even though I was one of the first people working with Vince and Rob, and I published with them, and I basically been talking about the importance of that study for years. I mean, I called it in a paper I wrote, the most important epidemiological study done in the last 2 decades. But that doesn't mean that the movement is the way policymakers should act on this information.
Yeah, and that's really, really important and interesting. To just go to, I don't know how much time you have, so I'll just ask this one about clinical practice, because one of the other things is trauma has been around since humans began, really, and seems to be increasing perhaps all the time with wars and relational disconnection, the breakdown of community, and all of these things making it more intense for people. But clinicians weren't always asking about trauma. Doctors weren't always asking about trauma. Teachers know nothing about trauma, a lot of them. So one of the values I see in the ACEs movement is saying we've got to start tuning into this. And trauma-informed care does require asking questions, doesn't it, about people's attachment histories and their experiences?
See, Jane, it depends on what you mean by trauma-informed care. If you go in the United States, actually anywhere, I made a set of slides because, people were using that language. And I had 12 slides, and there's one group has one definition, one item. There's another group that has 2 principles. Another group has 3 principles. Another group has 4 principles. I mean,
there's no agreement.
The language is important. And so people throw around trauma-informed care. It means one thing for one group, another thing for another group. So just for example, you just use the word, people need to use ACEs, whatever. And then you, on the list of the things that you assume is part of the ACE, integration into clinical work or education is something about attachment. The vast majority of people I know that talk about and teach trauma-informed care don't talk about attachment at all. They don't talk about development at all.
Okay.
They talk about the ACEs pyramid, and they talk about doing your ACE score, and they talk about the criterion for PTSD, and they talk about all kinds of stuff, and they're still not getting at the developmental trajectory that's really important. They're not getting at the power of relational connectedness at the key times in life. And so whenever people sort of use that language, I always try to get them to back off of the language and explain to me what you're talking about. And again, I mean, anybody who knows my work knows that I'm all about teaching people about trauma. I mean, that's what we've been doing for years. This book I just finished writing a book with Oprah, and it's all about.
That's exciting.
And we literally talk about all of this stuff because she was all over trauma-informed care. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? And, part of the book is conversations about clarifying, well, what is resilience? People throw that word out all the time too. And like, you act like resilience is something you can learn in a class, and you can't.
I can't wait for this book because I love Born for Love as well. And I only saw the 5-minute interview because that's all that was available in Ireland with you and Oprah, and how she was going, this is amazing. It's changed my whole life. But this information, when, as you say, is presented in its totality, is pretty life-changing, or can be.
It's absolutely important. I agree. And even, Jane, as you pointed out earlier, it doesn't even have to be in its totality.
Yeah.
For somebody who has been treated by the mental health world through this medical lens of the DSM, where you've just been given labels and labels and labels, and you haven't gotten any better, to understand that, listen, this isn't because there's something messed up with you. This is because something happened, and so the title of the book is like, what happened to you? And it's
Nice.
about just the way we are in the present is significantly influenced by our personal history. And if you don't understand that, you end up thinking that you're flawed when you can't do something. There's you're bad. It's particularly in the world you live in. All of those folks, not all of them, but the vast majority of them, by the time they ended up committing a crime, basically had their own internal view that the world's already thrown me away.
Yeah.
And I'm going to just basically, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, I'm bad. This is who I am. And rather than viewing themselves as somebody of worth and salvageable, and recognizing that there's a reason I'm here. And there's also a reason that I can I can also change this. That I think that that's something that we have to get much better at teaching people. I don't think it's doing your ACE. I mean, I don't care if people do it, but I also think that shouldn't be the end of the story.
Sure.
We have to make our educators, our physicians, our judges much more aware of the complexity of these issues. And we can do it. It's just we have to not get in our own way.
Yeah.
And honestly, part of what I think is happening is, I think at times the enthusiasm of the ACE movement is making us trip. It's getting in our own way.
Right.
Because it's like it starts these little side fights.
Yeah, where people who should be on the same side really start taking strips off each other. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And this is particularly, that's a mechanism that people in positions of power use all the time to derail innovation. And so the ACE study, its predominant power is that it is calling for a shift in the dominant medical framework around physical and mental health. And as long as we keep fighting with each other about this, the dominant perspective is going to fuel that. And it won't change.
Right.
And so I think part of what we have to do is try to be more precise. We have to develop better language. We have to talk about the difference between trauma aware, trauma informed, trauma specific, developmentally informed, which is different than all those trauma things. Yeah. That's just as important. All of these things, I think we have to be willing to abandon our language to develop a better understanding. Because it's, whenever there's a new field, a new, innovations like this, there's always sort of this kind of squabbling. And I think we have to get past the squabbling and actually, it's like the Tower of Babel. We have to stop arguing with each other and get back to building the tower. And,
sure. Could I just ask you one about the neurosequential model? Do you have the time?
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
Just because I know in your clinical work and in founding the Child Trauma Academy, you'll have worked yourself with many traumatized children, and you wrote about it in The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog as well. And one of the things that you've discovered is that there's a sequence that works effectively, and it's regulate, relate, reason. Can you say why that's effective in practice, and can it be used with adults as well, and people in prison and young offenders?
Well, the part of what we know is that at some point, if you want to influence the brain, you need to know something about the brain. And one of the things that's really important about the brain is that it develops from the bottom up, but it also, even after it's developed, it processes experience, input from the bottom up. So when you hear me and see me, if you're watching this, the visual input doesn't go right to your cortex. It goes to the lower parts of your brain. And there's a level of processing that takes place in the lower part of the brain. And then it goes to the middle part of the brain. And there's a level of processing that takes place there. And then it goes to the top part of the brain, and you finally see and interpret kind of what it is you're seeing. And so what we know is that if a person is dysregulated, if they're feeling threatened, anxious, hungry, full bladder, whatever, and information comes into those lower parts of the brain, that level of stress and distress is going to interfere with the efficient transfer of input from the bottom to the top of the brain. And so the first step that in the sequence of effective engagement to communicate, to teach, to get to anybody's cortex is to make sure that somebody's regulated. So they have to be regulated to a certain degree. And once they're regulated, then they can effectively use the parts of their brain that are involved in forming relationships, and they can connect with you. And then once they connect with you, then they're able to actually, hopefully, feel safe enough and regulated enough to open up the superhighway to the cortex. And so this sequence of engagement is true for everybody. Okay. Babies, children, adults, everybody. And I think everybody's probably had the experience as an adult of being very, very frustrated and having somebody try to use words to calm you down.
Yeah, or say calm down.
Or say calm down. And it doesn't work, right? It just makes you feel more dysregulated. And so the way, again, that's sort of an illustration of that violation of the sequence of engagement. Or telling somebody who's got really depressed to just, hey, feel better.
Cheer up.
Thanks a lot. Cheer up. Yeah. So once you know a little bit about how the brain processes, you can take advantage of that sequence, both therapeutically and in the way you communicate and all kinds of other things. And we use it in education all the time, very effectively, to think about how to create a classroom where there's enough regulation and enough sense of safety that kids are able to efficiently internalize the lessons and do better academically.
And have there been any applications of the neurosequential model in prisons or young offender institutes or community programs, Dr. Perry?
There have. We have a number of partners who are in mostly juvenile justice. Mm-hmm. And, we have a partner in San Mateo County that has a locked facility for juvenile offenders, and they had, I can't remember the number, but they had a lot of critical incidents and elopements and all kinds of other things. And when they started using the neurosequential model, they literally disappeared to the point where when they went to the county supervisors and were talking about it, the county supervisors are the people who sort of give out the money. Usually, people in our systems are begging them to fund things. They went and presented the results of the small amount of funding they got to do this. And the county said, hey, we want this everywhere. So they brought the model into their adult mental health clinics and a lot of their other systems. And so we have seen it. We're using it in there are a couple of places, like the Texas juvenile justice system is starting to use the neurosequential model. We've seen it in other places. I mean, part of the, as you know probably better than anybody, part of the problem with our current juvenile justice and adult criminal justice systems is that even if the leadership becomes enlightened about these issues, the people who are on the front lines, who are with the youth or the adults, frequently have a very fixed mindset about consequences and rewards and their punishment, And so it's a tough sell to some folks to ultimately take a developmental perspective on this. But when it does happen, it can be very powerful.
The other thing, I suppose, is the systems themselves can be in survival mode pretty much all of the time.
Exactly.
And staff can also be traumatized themselves. So that doesn't make for a very healthy environment. The very last question, Dr. Perry, and you've been so generous with your time. To go back to the social brain and the role of community in buffering moms, babies, families, do you think there's more that we can do in terms of public education or public policy to kind of reactivate those natural human impulses in us?
Well, there's a ton we can do. I mean, part of there are many things that we can do. I think a lot of the things that we could do are so much simpler than people think. One of the easiest things to do is to think about literally how we do civic planning. Making sure that we have spaces where people can meet and convene. Simply having young parents being able to literally run into each other in a park, have a place to sit where they can talk with somebody who's also a young parent. We have lots of examples where, for example, a children's museum in Houston, just because it was a natural convening place, ended up becoming a tremendous hub for the development of a whole host of healthy programs related to early childhood that were community derived. In other words, the mothers went there on their own, met each other, formed relationships, supported each other, and then started to ask the system, it would be great if the pediatric hospital could have a resident come here one morning, and instead of us having to go to the hospital for, we could get our well baby checkups here. And maybe we could have the pediatric dentist come. And so it's interesting because the hospital had been trying to develop community-based programs, but they didn't know how to, they were just plopping these clinics in the middle of nowhere and making parents travel. So this was an example of just a space where people could convene for free. There were things for the kids to do. The parents got together and said, this is what we need. They asked the system, and then the system brought it in. And it just was again, there's lots of examples of that kind of thing, where just by making the physical space available, we do that. We have said the same thing about schools, that we think that schools need to open their doors to young parents, so that the parent can be on site and the parents can get together on site and have some of their needs met. There should be on-site childcare. Parents can then go to class and they can get their GEDs or their high school equivalents. There's a lot of ways to use our public spaces in better ways. And I could go on and on. But
I know, and I would happily listen to you. But look, you've been so generous for taking this long call during COVID-19, which is making all these ways of connecting in real life a bit more challenging for people. But Dr. Bruce Perry, I am so grateful to you. Best of luck with your book. This has been Health Talk Policy and Influence People with me, Jane Mulcahy, and you've been listening to Dr. Bruce Perry. Thank you so much.